So welcome to this IRMS HEFE group webinar, and thank you for joining us. I'm delighted that Nicki Hargreaves has agreed to give the group an update on Manchester Metropolitan's journey from shared drives to Microsoft 365. And as I'm sure you know, Nicki is a respected information and records management professional who's worked in the higher education sector since 2018. Her current role is Information Assurance Specialist with a particular focus on governance and compliance within Microsoft 365. And over the next 50 minutes, Nicki will tell us a little bit about MMU's recently completed project to decommission their legacy network shares. She'll tell us how they educated and empowered staff to delete 73% of content and the approach they've taken to implementing basic governance within Microsoft 365. Finally, she'll describe their next steps. Nicki will be taking questions at the end, and as I say, to ask Nicki a question, please add it to the chat, starting with a Q, and I'll read out the questions at the end for Nicki to answer. But without further ado, over to Nicki.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to start sharing my slides now. There you go. Hopefully you can all see those now. So thank you very much for that introduction there. I am in Manchester, where it is grey as normal. But yes, I am an information assurance specialist at Manc University. I started in records management in 2013. I moved to Manc as records manager in 2018, and I moved into this current role in September 21. And like Anne says, my role is all things information assurance. So anything that covers the full information lifecycle, any aspect of it, but with that primary kind of governance and compliance within 365 focus. So I am here to talk about our project that we did to move from our shared drive into 365. I will say at this point, I did a presentation with one of my colleagues at the IRMS conference in May 2023, and I subsequently turned that into an article for the IRMS bulletin that was published last November. So this session is intended to be a kind of an update on how things have gone and additional detail on what we did. I'm going to try not to repeat what I said in either of those things, but obviously I'll give a quick overview of what the project was for anybody who isn't aware. But apologies to anybody that has heard some of the intro content before. Hopefully there won't be too much repetition there. So we approached this project in stages, and we defined some really key focus areas, and I've used those to form a little bit of an agenda. Obviously, I'll start with a quick introduction and an overview and the timelines that we were working towards, but then the first main stage was cleanup of the content. This was never, ever going to be a lift and shift, and that was an absolute key point for us. We knew that the shared drive had content that shouldn't have been there, so we weren't about to just simply move that somewhere else. You can see the result of the cleanup on the slide there, and I will talk about how we got to that point and how we ultimately deleted that content. The second key stage then was governance in 365, another absolutely really important one for us, adding some form of lifecycle management onto 365, essentially so that we don't just recreate the problems that we had with the shared drive. By governance, I do mean very, very basic governance in the form of automating some deletion for now, but it was only ever intended to be just a start for that. It's just a building block, basically. So I will talk about our approach to that governance. So those are the two absolute key focus areas that I'm going to talk about, but then the others that I will touch on are the change management. This project was as much a change management initiative as it was a records management initiative. And all the way through this project, we had a huge focus on change management. We had amazing change management specialists working with us, so I will give you an overview of that. And then the final stage is the next steps, the kind of what have we done since the project closed? Where do we go from here? I will say at this point, unfortunately, that section is going to be shorter than I would have liked, but I will go over it. So in terms of what the project was, Yes, it was to move from the shared drive into SharePoint. The shared drive that we had, it was called the R drive. Your very typical shared drive. It had 62 terabytes of content that dated back far, far too long. It had been very inconsistently managed. It was out of date structures. It had been implemented 10 years earlier, so very, very out of date. It was staff content that it held. It was generally team administrative, operational type content. There should have been no student records in there. There should have been no research content in there. We have dedicated systems for those things. There was obviously no automated deletion. There was very little functionality, as you would expect with a shared drive. So the risks that we had with that, of course, the over-retention of everything, but over-retention of personal data. And then the thing that absolutely triggered the project happening when it did was the risk that we had that the hardware was going out of support. So on a technical level, we had to do the project when we did for that exact reason, but that actually had very little bearing on the approach that we took to the project. So the point of moving into SharePoint was to improve the user experience. It was to improve assurance over the management, the security of information. It was to introduce some kind of automation. It was to build in that limited governance with the intention that those governance controls would be applied in a kind of baby steps, like phased kind of way. So what we were doing really was laying the foundations that we can then build on. All the way through, we treated this absolutely as an information project, and we were constantly repeating to people, almost as a mantra, this is an information project. It is not a technical project. Had it just been a purely technical project, it would never have been led by the information assurance team. So it was an information project. Information lifecycle management considerations were an absolute key driver for what we did, and we tried to keep those at the absolute heart of the project throughout. The project itself was sponsored by our Chief Information Security Officer. He is also my manager. His remit includes information assurance. So as a team, we cover the entire information lifecycle from all angles. It's not just security, but it's protection, it's use, it's management of information too. So his sponsorship of the project came from that part of his remit, and it really reinforced the point that this was all about the information. So just to give you an idea of the timescales that we were initially working to, we very first got everybody together in a kickoff meeting for this project in October 2022. And that was absolutely anybody and everybody that we thought might have some kind of interest in, might have a stake in, might have some requirements to meet, might have something to offer or something to gain from this project. So we introduced it out, what we knew at the time, to everybody, and then we just asked them to come back to us and talk to us, tell us whatever we need to know, tell us what you need us to know, tell us what you need from the project, tell us what you need to see, what you need to gain, tell us what you can offer. And we used all of that in planning, which then took place between October 2022 and January 2023. At this point, if I'm honest, I think we were all still a little bit overwhelmed with the scale of what was actually required. So we cut it down into manageable chunks based on what we knew at the time. And that's the next things that you see there. So we always do a pre-pilot, and we always do that with the IT team. And there's two key reasons for that. One, if we're going to ask the university to do something, especially if the ask is not going to be the most popular thing, we have to be seen to be doing it ourselves, because if we can't do it ourselves, we can't expect anybody else to do it. So we absolutely have to be able to say that IT is on board and has done this. But then the second reason is that if we really don't actually know how we're going to make something work or what we're going to do, then IT are our friends and they're our colleagues. So we kind of just throw things at them, different ideas, different suggestions, different ways of trying to make it work. And we just see what sticks. We basically kind of test it all out on them and refine it down into something that is then presentable to the rest of the university. They are essentially, they're basically our guinea pigs. We then did a proper pilot that was with an academic area. So that was one team within one of our faculties, and we did it with our estates directorate. They are the absolute biggest team across the university, so they have a huge amount of content. They were also very eager to get started, and they'd done some work independently as well, so we wanted to get on board with that and get them on board with our project. So we had lessons both from the academic side and the faculty side. So the cleanup was intended to be March until the end of June 23. That end of June date was especially important on the academic side because, as we know, academics are going to disappear over the summer break and it wouldn't be done. We had the define and build section stage that was running alongside cleanup, was primarily the project team defining exactly what we needed from 365. So the structures, the architecture, the governance, that kind of thing. And then we had the migration stage. We wanted to give ourselves plenty of time to migrate any content. So we intended to begin in July and then finish by the end of December. The hardware risk that I talked about, that hardware was going end of life in early 2024. So having it all completed by December 23 kind of left us with a little bit of breathing room. So what you see here is the actual timescales, the differences in red there. We spent a lot longer on the pilot than we initially thought we would, than we initially anticipated. We did try and turn this into a positive. We saw it as an investment because it made us so much more confident when we went out and started presenting to areas, because we knew that what we were asking for was possible. We knew it could work. The cleanup, we started running sessions out to everybody in May 2023. We still asked for it to be done by the end of June 2023. Realistically, we knew that wasn't going to happen, but we wanted to focus people's minds as much as possible. So any deadline that we ever gave out to any users at any point always had a certain amount of contingency built into it. We always tried to recognize as well that people have got different priorities, different areas have got different busy periods throughout the year. So we knew we needed to recognize that and understand it and be flexible around it. But at the same time, we knew that if you give somebody 4 months to do something, then they're going to probably ignore it for 3.5 months. And then they're going to spend a week worrying about it and asking some initial questions. And then they're going to do a quick rush job in the very last week. So we thought if we keep those timescales short, we'll try and focus people's minds on it. And we'll use the fact that we have engagement from above and buy-in from above as a way of getting people to do this. And I'll talk about that engagement and buy-in from above later. So realistically, we did see some people finish by around about June time, but most of those users carried on reviewing and deleting their content right up until literally the point when their content was migrated. We also introduced a migration preparation checklist that they could go through, and I will go into that in more detail as well. But going through that checklist prompted users to carry on doing more deletions, so it kind of just continued. And obviously we weren't ever going to tell them to stop deleting. You know, if there's more to do, just keep doing it. So the migrations themselves didn't actually begin until September. Everything was done by the end of December 2023, except for one area. And that area was by far the most complicated area that we had, partly because there have been so many structural changes over the years, and that those structural changes hadn't necessarily translated into users sorting out their content. They'd either kind of move what they wanted, taken that with them, and then just orphaned, left the rest orphaned away in the old structure, or they tried to build on to the old structure. So essentially things were anywhere and everywhere, and it was very, very tricky. And then obviously staff changes that had happened in the 10 years that it had been in operation made it very, very hard to find people who at any point had owned that content or knew what it was or knew that it was there. All of that was then compounded by the fact that this was student content as well. So there was, on the one hand, the very, very clear over retention risk, but it was also the only place that certain long-term and permanent preservation records were held. So we couldn't just take one very high level view of this and say, right, you need to get rid of it all, it's too old. For example, there were student transcripts in there, so we had to deal with that properly and we had to go through everything. So when I said 2 slides ago that there should have been no student records and no research content in there, that's what we thought at the start, and that those things weren't always true. So moving on to the cleanup. As I said, we would never ever have allowed this to have been a lift and shift given the recognised risks. But then of course it's also a massive, massive opportunity to gain assurance over the information as well. But that in itself kind of made it the biggest and the most challenging part of the project. So the very first question we had was, who is going to do this cleanup? So we have at the university an existing governance structure that has information asset owners and information asset managers. So the IAOs are our directors of the professional services directorates and the faculty pro-vice chancellors. There's one per area. They are essentially the top person in any given area. The information asset managers are generally direct reports of the IAOs, but there's more than one in each area. There's kind of one per team. So if you think the IAOs cover the functions, then the IAMs cover the activities, but still at a very high level. But that is intentional. They are intentionally at a level where they are expected to understand the information flows in and out of their areas, and they are empowered to make decisions on all things information governance. And that works. But what we found in previous projects is that the information asset managers are still at too high a level to do the kind of operational day-to-day stuff. So we thought it was very unlikely that they would be the ones doing the actual cleanup, and they were the people that we wanted to talk to, the ones who were doing the actual cleanup. So what we did to counter this was to set up a new network of information asset champions. And these were going to be the people who will be working with us to do the actual reviews and would then in time move on to setting up new SharePoint sites, to preparing content for migration, to undertaking the post-migration checks. Generally, they were just intended to be the point of contact, kind of the bridge between the project and the local area. And we wanted at least one per local team. And with all of these champions, we put them into a new Microsoft team so that we could easily communicate with everybody. I think we had about 260 to 280, I think, at full capacity. So the only potential downside that we saw with doing it this way was that we were asking for staff who could dedicate the time to be reviewing the content. And obviously that was always going to end in deletion of some of that content. But we also knew and we recognized that it wasn't necessarily always fair to put that kind of decision-making responsibility onto those champions, because they wouldn't always feel confident in doing that and making that decision. It wasn't necessarily their role. And so we devised a way to do it that they could still do it. They could make all of the recommendations, but they could still get the IAM approval before any deletions took place. So that was who. Moving on to how they did it. This logo you see here on the left is the TreeSize professional tool. So we made the TreeSize file scanning tool available to anybody in the university to download if they wanted to. We genuinely could not have done this without TreeSize. I know other file scanning tools are available. I'm sure they do the exact same thing, but the beauty of TreeSize is that it just gives a kind of really high level overview. That means you don't have to click into every single folder. And that is especially useful if you've got very large amounts of really deeply nested folders, sometimes 15, 20 levels deep. So we ran a couple of weeks worth of hour-long training sessions for all of these new champions once we'd got them recruited. And that hour-long training session included an introduction to the project and what we saw was going to be their role in it. Why compliance and therefore the cleanup was so important. We gave them a kind of an introduction and overview of the retention schedule and how that fitted in, because obviously we needed people to understand how to navigate that because it's a SharePoint list. But we also wanted them to feel empowered by it. The schedule itself is signed off by information asset owners. So we wanted them to understand that if they were deleting in line with what the retention schedule says, then they could just do it and they could feel confident in doing that. So we then gave them an overview of these main content types to look for. What we did with this was keep it as absolutely simple as we possibly could. And we told users that absolutely everything you're ever going to find is going to fit into one of these types. So the records out of retention, obviously the content that should already have been deleted, the inactive content, so it's no longer in use, you know, the case has ended, the academic year has finished, but you can't delete it because it's awaiting the end of its retention period. And then the active content, so the really, really valuable stuff that you're working on day to day that needs properly dealing with. We also asked them to be aware of the rot content. So anything fitting the redundant, obsolete, trivial definition, just get rid of it. What we called non-standard, and by non-standard, what we meant was things that don't work in SharePoint. The best example there being access databases. There were many of those, or anything that had some kind of integration into the shared drive that was going to break if we then put it into SharePoint. And with those things, we asked them to isolate them, to report them to us via a form. They were not in scope of our project, but they have since all been dealt with via a different project. And then the final thing to be aware of was any potentially archival content. With this, we asked them to treat it as the same as the inactive content, but to mark it as archival. And that was simply for ease of identification at a later date. So as a university, we don't have Public Records Act responsibilities. We also don't have a corporate university archive. And as far as I can tell, we have very little appetite for that to change. But there are absolutely some advocates out there, and we really don't want to lose the good stuff. So we did what we could to make sure that that was all identified. So those initial kind of what to focus on, what to be aware of parts probably took the first half of that hour-long session. We then spent the rest of it giving a demo on how to use the tree size tool. We showed users how to change the scanning parameters. We explained the recommended setup that we had come up with that we thought would be most beneficial for people. We then went over an example of how we had made all of this cleanup work in one of the IT areas. That was kind of from a, look, you don't have to do it this way, but this is what worked from us perspective. And very often the best thing that we could tell people was just to get everybody together in one room or in one meeting and just spend an hour or 2 hours going over it and making decisions at that point and acting on those decisions immediately. So the intention was, after these hour-long sessions, people were effectively but kind of ready to go. We did have several champions attend more than one of those sessions just to reinforce their own learning. Obviously, it was just a repeat of the same session, but it was just, like I say, just to reinforce their learning so that they could ask any questions that they'd thought of after the first one. On top of that, we offered any kind of additional tree size training that anybody wanted. We offered Teams training, we did face-to-face training, we recorded videos on how things have been done, we had knowledge-based articles, we ran drop-in sessions over a period of weeks that people could just come along and ask little questions to. And we had case studies that we published from how the IT team and how the pilot areas had done it. We then also had business analysts who were dedicated to each of the specific areas and were always on hand to support any of the champions. And if they couldn't answer the question, they would direct users to the subject matter experts. So the digital skills lead that we have for training or for tree size, me for the information management stuff, our project manager if it was project or timescales related or anything like that. So this slide, top tips we gave to users, is pretty much taken directly from our guidance. Just shows the top tips to users, and we didn't sit and read this through them. We just asked them to kind of go away and read through it themselves. But the absolute main point that we made to absolutely everybody was start at the top level. Treat your information as a series at the highest level that you can confidently do so, and be brave, make bold, high-level decisions. Do not attempt your cleanup at individual item or document level. So that 62 terabytes that I talked about equated to over 23 million individual items. So obviously trying to do it at individual level was disproportionate, it's unrealistic, but it's actually not remotely achievable either. So we recognized the reviews were necessarily going to be risk-based. And yes, there were different levels of risk to different information in different areas. And that's why we needed the local champions, the people who knew their information. We needed them to review it, to make those decisions. So our guidance was there, and it was intended to mitigate the risks as much as it possibly could. And obviously the decisions made by any of the champions were reviewed by IAMs before their deletion took place. One thing we really highlighted to users was to ask them to focus on value rather than kind of using the terminology of records, which they didn't necessarily understand the concept of, but they always got that the content brought value and how long that value was going to last. And we found many areas of the file plan that nobody was able to access due to all of the changes of the shared drive, due to different university departments changing, things had just moved on, content had just been forgotten about. So in those instances, again, we just highlighted the value, and we said to the areas that would own that content, use this as your starting point in determining the value. You know, you haven't been able to access this for X amount of years, you haven't missed it. In some cases, you didn't even know it existed. Why would you even want it now? So we really, really tried to drill into people that if they couldn't identify a valid reason for keeping that content, then it should be deleted. I was at the IRMS conference in May this year, and I was at a session that was talking about the very similar kind of cleanup activities that they had been through. And what the speaker said was that for every one instance of loss of valuable content that had later found to be needed, they could have given out 10 instances, 10 examples of bad practice or risky over retention. And that was absolutely our experience as well. That was absolutely true for us. So just to give you a little bit of an idea of tree size, so you can hopefully see why I rate it so much. These are the standard scan results that you can see here. What you can see there is the details tab. And if you go over to the top left there, you can see that there are just over 30,000 files in this area, and then all the folders below that tell you how many files, how much is in each one. With these numbers of files, you can change that to show how much is, how much storage is being used. You can then over here see the percentage of parent, and that tells you that almost 60% of those 30,000 files are in one folder, this one folder, and that one folder has 7 folders of its own beneath it. So if you then click into that folder, and that's this one underneath, what you can see there is that it has 4 subfolders, and 3 of those have their own subfolders, so there's your 7 folders, but still 99% of the content is in this one area. So you just get that immediate kind of high-level overview of where most of the content is, so you know where to focus your efforts, really. You can also use this Users tab here to get the information on who is using the area, who is modifying content in there. Again, percentage of parents are who is using the most of the content. In some cases, we did find that users had left and there was absolutely no way of identifying who that user was and kind of tracing it back. But as long as you had other people who were identifiable, you at least always had a starting point there. And then the other area that I really liked in tree size was the age of files tab. So we've got a few defined down here, but it's fully customizable. You can define it based on your own retention and disposal schedule, so you can immediately begin, at least hope to begin to identify where you might have over-retained content. And then the final thing that tree size does that I really loved was that if you were to click into one of these columns, it would open up what's called the file search module, and then it would give you the content that was over retained or that was all that age. So you can immediately start dealing with it from within tree size. But that file search module also offers the ability to perform searches on anything and everything that you want to do. But it also offers templated searches as well. So you could search for things like empty folders or duplicated content. And that duplicated content was an absolutely massive one for us because there was duplicates all over the place. So it really tells you where to focus your efforts using tree size. It tells you how to start to make an immediate impact and start to get some real gains there. So this is the desired outcome. This is the outcome that we were asking champions to work towards. So records out of retention and the BROT all deleted. Obviously for records, we asked them to do that properly, to do it defensibly, to create proper audit trails. And you can do that again from within tree size. So we'd given them guidance on how to do that. We asked for the non-standard content to be isolated. We asked for the active content to be left as is and the inactive content to be structured by deletion year, as you can see there on the slide. So only the active content and the inactive content was destined for SharePoint. So we set up our SharePoint structures so that we had active sites and inactive sites. And the difference between those was the URL. And what that meant was that we could then use the adaptive scope functionality within Purview to offer out different deletion labels to those sites. So those inactive sites that we set up, they were a one-time thing. They were there set up to hold the inactive content that came from the shared drive only. They are not being used on an ongoing basis. They're not offered anymore. The inactive sites will only exist until the retention periods for all of the content that is in them are met. And then once content has been deleted, the sites themselves will be deleted. But the labels that we've made available on those inactive sites are there to enable users to delete at the end of the deletion year that they specified during that cleanup. So in terms of, what did I do? Yeah, expectations versus reality. What we expected, if I'm being honest, during the planning phases, when we were feeling a little bit overwhelmed and we knew how much we were asking for in terms of cleanup, what we expected was a lack of engagement. We thought people would push back on the requirement to do all of this by arguing they were too busy, that it was the last thing on the list, that it's not their day job, that it's taken them away from more important stuff, it's not what their managers want them to be doing. We always expected that reluctance to come from a time and a resource perspective, but we also expected reluctance to come, I think, from a place of fear as well. So lack of confidence in deleting content, the kind of just in case stuff, what if we need it in the future? But also a lack of knowledge around the retention schedule, around the retention requirements, and around why compliance is so important. And it sounds a bit harsh, it sounds a bit unfair to say it now, but we really did expect the worst. But I think that worked out well for us because we prepared for it. So the first thing that we did to prepare for that was we really focused on getting support at a very senior level. So like I said at the start, our project sponsor was our Chief Information Security Officer. He has information assurance in his remit, so obviously that underlined the project. So at the start of the project, we got our CISO in his capacity as project sponsor to go along to all senior level meetings. That's all of the information asset owners and their senior teams. And I went with him, and together we presented exactly what was going to happen, what we had planned, what we were going to expect from them, what they should expect, and we asked them for their cooperation. And the hope there really was that the importance was going to come from the very top of our project to the very top person in each individual area, and it would kind of cascade down and they would be supportive when the time came. We spent time focusing on guidance. We made it as simple as we possibly could. The absolute honest answer to pretty much any question that we ever faced during this project was, it depends, to the point that it depends almost became like a tagline for the project, but obviously we couldn't give that answer to champions. So we took the time to define those main content types and to really assure people that absolutely everything they had was going to fit into one of those. So we gave them really clear guidance. We showed them how to use tree size. We ran those pilots as well. So we really invested that time at the start to get it right. So we were confident in the approach when we presented it out. And we really spent that time trying to educate and empower those people to make bold decisions. Our CISO's view has always been that over-retention is a much, much greater risk than under-retention. So it was always more of a, why should we keep this approach? If users couldn't give us a very, very clear justification for retaining something, we would encourage them to delete it. So we really, really invested in that preparation side so that we could answer any questions, any challenges. The result that we got, engagement was generally very, very positive. This is something that users actually wanted. And that's not to say that happened everywhere. There were some areas we expected to be really, really good and really on board and really engaged with us. And we were actually, to be honest, really disappointed by. But far more than we expected, it was a really, really positive experience. Users were given the time by their managers and they reacted very positively to guidance. They were actually worried about compliance themselves. So even if they didn't have that full grasp of retention requirements, they still had some kind of level of knowledge of GDPR, even if it was kind of a very basic understanding that they probably shouldn't still have that really sensitive personal data from so long ago. And we did see a big increase in user understanding and retention requirements, which obviously has helped since then. So the final cleanup outcome, and I have got my cup right here as well. I don't know if I hope you can see this. This is our cup. We had an absolutely amazing project manager who made all of this happen for us. And at the end of the project, she made us all a cup to commemorate the fact that we survived the R drive. But what you can see there is the absolute final cleanup outcome, and the 1% that's missing from that graphic was the non-standard content that wasn't ever going into SharePoint. And then migration preparation. So even when users had completed their cleanup, there was still a process for them to follow to ensure that content was ready for migration. So this slide shows what that process was asking them to look at. Now, obviously, some of this had been included in the cleanup, so should already have been done, but we chose to include it here as well to kind of, just prompt them to check, to do it again. And that was why the content was still being deleted right up until the migration. Some of the other points on here were included to prepare them from a kind of SharePoint usability perspective. So from the deeply nested folders, don't use them. Watch out for how much content you've got in folders, that kind of thing. And everything that we had linked to additional guidance on what the impact of it was, why it mattered, what to do about it, what SharePoint offered that could do it better. So the migration preparation checklist itself was quite long. It was quite detailed, and it almost looked like we were asking a lot, especially after they'd just done all of that cleanup as well. But we did that to ensure that absolutely everything was covered. Really, we were trying to preempt any problems there. So again, it was all about the preparation. And the result of that was actually when we did the migrations, really nothing went wrong. They were all very, very, very successful migrations. I have put at the bottom there, be strict with users about when their migration will happen. And the reason for that is that we weren't, and that was a really big lesson for us, at least not at first, we weren't. So when the project team was ready to start migrating and we were happy with all of our processes and we'd tested and we'd retested and we piloted, we published this out to champions, but we left it to them to come to us when they wanted to migrate their content. Now, we knew at the time we could migrate a maximum of X gig per night and X gig per weekend, and we'd worked out a kind of migration timeline based on our projections of content that remained on the shared drive at the time. So we knew when we needed to start migrating, we knew how much we needed to get through week on week in order to have it all complete by December. What we hadn't accounted for was that every single one of the champions was going to want to leave their migration until the absolute last possible date. So we didn't get any migrations in the first couple of weeks, and we very quickly had to start chasing people who we knew we were ready, but they were just kind of holding off for whatever reason. Again, probably fear. So that was the cleanup. In terms of governance in 365, like I've said, it was very, 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 very basic baby steps here. The objective was to get in some foundations that we can build on. And the biggest challenge that we had with that really was doing what could we do that wasn't then going to back us into a corner and create problems later down the line. So anything that we came up with, we worked with consultants on. So fingers crossed we won't experience problems. I would add at this point, we have the full A5 records management capabilities available to us, but we are not using them to the full extent at this point. We had defined a minimum viable product, and that was sites with background deletion policies available and implemented and labels available for users to choose themselves. One thing that's important to say is we didn't work with individual areas to define their requirements. Absolutely recognize that that would, of course, have been ideal, but we couldn't have done that. We had no time, and the focus of the project was to get off the shared drive. So that meant we had to implement something that worked for everybody. Now, obviously, in retention terms, that's impossible. There is no one size fits all. But the solution that we came up with was kind of risk-based, bucketed labels that have been made available to all areas of the university. They are not an application of the retention schedule. They're not designed to be, they can't be, but they are something that enables deletion after defined periods. In terms of the configuration, I won't get too much into the SharePoint technicalities, but you can either set content to retain in the background for X amount of time, even if a user deletes it from view, or you can allow it to just go. So everything we have done allows it to just go. So it is immediately deleted when a user deletes it. Nothing is being retained in the background at all. And then everything we have set triggers from last modified date. Again, not perfect, but we just wanted something to keep it very, very consistent and to aid user understanding. So the policies and the labels that we've set, they are the policies. Obviously in the background, they are controlled by administrators, they are invisible to the users. They are 12, 15 or 20 years, depending on the university area and the type of information that's processed. They were chosen based on retention and disposal schedule requirements. They generally are there to offer quite a generous buffer from the end of the maximum retention period for any content, but not for all. They're not intended to be a solution for records, but they are there to catch the stuff that just has no value at that point and would otherwise just sit there forever. The labels are visible to users. Obviously, they are controlled by users and they allow users to delete content 2, 4, 7, 10 or 30 years after last modified date. And that 30 years is currently the solution for any content that needs to be kept longer than that 12, 15 or 20-year background policy. And the intention behind that is to enable us to identify that content easily so that we can then target next steps and find better targeted solutions. So the labels we made available around about last September, I think. The policies, because they were being applied to all sites and not just new sites, they were implemented in March this year, March 24, because we did an extensive campaign to target owners of all existing SharePoint sites that had content that we knew would be captured. So essentially content that was already 12 years old or older, because obviously we needed to allow them time to review that content and to add those labels if necessary. And final point on governance is that retrospective governance is a really, really hard thing. But we had no choice. We weren't starting from scratch here. It would have been much, much easier if we were, but I think realistically, everybody has content in 365 these days. We certainly had a huge amount of content in SharePoint already. We had many teams kind of using a hybrid model of some content in SharePoint and some content on the shared drive. So we'd had a lot of conversations at the start of the project about whether we should create things like site templates and then have defined libraries and have the retention already set on those libraries. But because we knew that most of the content was very likely to be migrated into existing sites, we decided that those site templates and things like that just wouldn't offer any value, the value that we wanted to get from it. So we haven't done that yet. That's not to say that we wouldn't do it, but it just wasn't the time then. So moving on to change management, it's obviously so important to take users with you. And like I said at the start, this is as big a change initiative as it was a records management one. There were two key focus areas, really, I think, within the change management side. The first one, how to keep our users, and especially the champions, engaged with our project as it progressed, but also how to get all users to understand any changes we were making to SharePoint. So how we approached this was we had that Microsoft team that had all of the champions in it. We had regular updates on every aspect of the project, everything that affected them. We kept them updated with all project milestones and anything and everything that was going on. We used all of the functionality that Teams offered. So we tagged people in it, we tagged users in it to ensure that they were getting notifications and things weren't just being missed. We had channels for each area that only had the specific users in, so we could put more personalized content in there. And we had the business analysts dedicated to each area speaking directly to champions on a regular basis. And I said this already in terms of the training, but at all times, we really made ourselves available as a project team. So all project team members were very, very visible. So people knew exactly who to speak to. We recognized that people are fearful of change. I think change happens because of progress, and that has to be a good thing. So why do people see it as a bad thing? But we had a real key focus of getting users comfortable and confident with that change. And that included getting those senior staff on board and getting them to be giving out the right message. So it was at least being cascaded from the right place. So it didn't just come through the Microsoft team. It was also intranet, it was email, it was those senior staffs, it was team meetings, anything and everything really that we could offer out. And those champions really were our way into absolutely everybody. We also offered endless training sessions on SharePoint, several sessions a week for weeks and weeks and weeks until the demand for them dropped. We definitely saw huge numbers of attendance for those SharePoint training sessions, so that obviously increased user confidence as well. And then the second focus area was how to build a better future, how to improve information long term by building better information management habits into BAU. So we want to change people's habits. We want to change ways of working because everybody benefits from that. But that's an ongoing initiative, that one. It's not going to happen quickly. It's a culture change. The biggest thing we have done on this so far is to build a community of practice. So that champion network that we created at the start, although it fits into that existing information governance network, we didn't have enough from purely information governance perspective to keep that network going long term. So we decided to turn it into a Microsoft 365 community of practice. So obviously we gave everybody the opportunity to opt out, but those that didn't, we moved them into a new Microsoft team that is the new community of practice. And where we see this going, what we want it to do is to give all members the opportunity to learn kind of both from the experts within IT, but also from each other, how to get the best out of 365. So we've asked users to contribute themselves by sharing their success stories, their good practice, and we will post regular blogs on there on various topics. And in time, we hope that this community might be able to gain visibility of new and upcoming features, and maybe even to work with us and to develop and to influence changes that are happening. We do expect these community members to still be the champion in their area. So we want them to be spreading the message across their area, and, you know, and hopefully that will kind of bring about the culture change that we're looking for. This element of it is obviously it's a marathon, it's not a sprint, that one. And then finally, on the next steps, what has happened since the project closed? It is unfortunately fairly short, this section, because if I'm honest, we haven't made the progress that I would have liked to see. Other issues have taken over this year, but we definitely have better knowledge at this point in time, including a better view of what do users need that can't be met by that basic implementation that I've already described. And there are three key things there: events-based retention, disposition reviews, and obviously a better dedicated solution for areas where that 30-year label is justifiably being used. And as an example of that, health and safety content, obviously we need to find a better solution for that. At least for that last one, we've bought ourselves some time because we know that content isn't going to go. For the first two, we still do need to do that dedicated piece of work to collect requirements and look at exactly where that's needed and build specific solutions for those specific areas. In terms of immediate priorities for the university, and this is the thing that's really taken a lot of resource from the technical teams this year, it's working to ensure that we aren't wasting any storage space that we have in Microsoft. Those of you who are in education will know about the changes that Microsoft are introducing. So they are capping the storage that we have available to us and charging huge amounts for additional storage. So there are a few one-off initiatives that we have been looking at to kind of claw back some space, and those have been the focus of the year so far. But really the only way to keep on top of what we have in Microsoft on an ongoing basis is to be managing the full information lifecycle. So my hope is that while the new storage cap is seen as a bit of a pain by anybody else, I think it will actually prompt the kind of necessary additional work in this area. It's really going to bring the importance of it to the fore. So then all these other kind of governance-y bits that I want to push, that I've been pushing for, can actually be looked at. So like I say, not much movement on that bit so far. Unfortunately, we will be meeting next week. So it's a bit of a case of watch this space at the moment. And that was all of the content that I have. My email address is there, my LinkedIn profile is on there. I am very happy to take any questions now, though, if there are any.
Thank you, Nicki. That was really fascinating, and I'm sure for those of us, especially who are working in an HE environment, there's a lot of stuff in there that we can learn from. I know, and I love your mug. I think that's a fantastic.
It's awesome, isn't it? It is awesome.
We've got lots of questions in the chat, so I shall start going through them. If we don't get to all of them, perhaps we can kind of maybe do some follow-up afterwards, because we've got some fab questions here. So to start off, starting at the top, and I will scroll down. So first question, you said you had good buy-in, so this might not have happened, but perhaps you planned for it. What would have happened if the area did not engage at all, didn't do any of the cleanup and so on? Did you have a strategy for how you would deal with that? Perhaps you did it with orphan content.
Yes. Generally we had good buy-in, but it did happen. What we did, there were a couple of areas that we ended up escalating. So we had the business analysts working primarily with the champions. If they saw that things weren't moving along, they would report it either to me or to our project manager. We would meet with the areas and try and understand why they weren't making any progress. If we still didn't get anywhere, it would end up being escalated to our CISO, our project sponsor. And where necessary, and it did happen a couple of times, he would then escalate it to the IAO in that area, and they would kind of basically force it to happen. With orphan content, we ended up having an orphan content policy, because we did have limited areas where we genuinely could not find a single person who actually owned the content or knew anything about it or had any clue what it was. So we ended up having an orphan content policy that the project board signed off, that essentially said if it met these exact criteria, the project team would decide what to do with that content. Generally, obviously, delete it. We tried not to do that, but we did where we had to.
Thank you. And our next question, did you use sensitivity labels as well as retention labels?
No. We're looking at those, but no, not yet.
Okay. I noticed you said that you had retention on inactive sites and retention labeling on documents and folders. Did you have retention on Teams chats as well?
Yes. So when we implemented Teams, it was a very, very, very quick implementation in light of the pandemic. Basically, it happened in 2020. But we got a 12-month retention period on chats. Yes. The one thing we don't have retention on is Teams channels, but yeah, chats are 12 months.
Thanks. Did you restrict any features of Microsoft 365, e.g. creation of Teams, 365 groups or Yammer and so on?
Yes, so when we implemented Teams in 2020, the one thing we did do was restrict creation of groups. So and we have an automated process, so it goes through our ticketing system basically. That we don't. I say restrict. We mean they can't do it individually. They can't do it independently, but all they have to do is put in a request, and it will get done. They're very, very, very rarely, if ever, refused. They're still going to get created. It just means they have to go through the process. And what that means for us is that we've then got the information about who is creating teams and who is creating, and it collects the information that we want. So.
Thanks. Did you recruit additional staff for the project? And if so, how many?
Yes. Yeah, we were very, very lucky that we had a really well-resourced project team. So we had 3 business analysts. We had myself, we had a project manager, we had a digital skills training lead, we had a couple of change specialists. We had a whole load of technical people, so collaboration, team lead, and we had a senior engineer from there, and then we had 2 other consultants that joined us, 2 other contractors that joined us. I think we probably had like 15 people. Yeah, we were very fortunate in that we had the resource. Yes. Yeah.
Wow. Yes. Are labels mandatory? If not, how will you deal with unlabeled content?
They are not mandatory. And how we deal with unlabeled content it's a difficult one, to be honest. It's a tricky one. So we've got those background policies, 12, 15, 20 years, that mean nothing is going to sit there forever. People don't have to label content if they don't want to, if they are happy to leave it. But if I'm honest, I don't think we would want to get to a point where absolutely everything is covered by one of those 24710 labels. So I think we're happy with what we've seen so far. I have access to Purview in the Compliance Centre, and I can see how much labelling is happening. So I've seen that it's been really good so far. That obviously doesn't mean it's going to continue because it's kind of new, but we need to keep on that. I will be able to see if it kind of falls away. But yeah, that's a kind of next steps question as well.
Did you have to consider the licensing for 365 in terms of maximum storage upgrade considerations? You touched on this a little already.
I did, yeah. So at the start of this project, we had A3 licensing, and we bought the information protection and governance add-on so that we could then default labels onto document libraries. We have since upgraded to full A5 anyway, so we have the full stuff.
What did you end up doing with the Access databases?
They are moving into another project, so they've been moved off the storage they were on and they've been moved to a safer place, but again, there's no there's no easy answer to that. They are still being used at the moment. We don't want them to be used. We need to find better solutions, but it's not happened in the last 6 months. There is a project that is starting to look at what we can do and how we can get rid of them and make it better. We are restricting people from creating new ones, so we've hopefully kind of stemmed the tide a little bit.
Did you just focus on shared drive data? What about data that had already been put in SharePoint or Teams?
It was just shared drive data, yes, because this project was to get off the shared drive and into SharePoint. We didn't really spend a huge amount of time looking at data that was already in SharePoint, to be honest. I would love us to be able to do that, but I think it would be a huge project. So the only thing we've done that impacts on data that's already in there is put those policies in the background and make the labels available.
Mm-hmm. Did you try and get the IAMs and or IACs to restructure the data on the R drive before it was migrated, or after the cleanup? Was it migrated as is?
No, we did tell them to restructure, and our project manager and different people spent so much time with different areas, and we had all the kind of metadata guidance and all that kind of thing out there. So if you want to restructure, this is the perfect time to do it. So do it. Like, you know, if it's working for you, fine, you can move it into SharePoint. If it's not, take this opportunity. So yes, we didn't force them to do it, but we gave them the opportunity and we tried to make it happen for them. Yeah.
How did you cope with cleaning up shared drives that were shared across multiple areas with no clear defined IAM or IAC?
Probably two ways. One, the orphaned content policy where we were really stuck that I mentioned, and then the other one was the area that I said that kind of transferred over into January. We had to kind of work with people to break it down. We tried to break it down at the highest level we possibly could, but when in some cases we ended up breaking it down at really low levels of the file plan, that yeah, it was time consuming sometimes, but yeah, we found people eventually.
I think you've already spoken a little bit about the project team, but this question is, did you have all the necessary Microsoft 365 expertise already, or did you need to use external contractors?
So we had within the technical team, we had the collaboration team lead and a senior engineer who are both massively knowledgeable on SharePoint and have a huge amount of knowledge. We got two contractors in as well to kind of help us with the migration and help us out with those things. But essentially, yes, we had the expertise. Yeah.
Did you move your organisation intranet to SharePoint or maintain a separate intranet as well as SharePoint?
Oh, SharePoint is always, the intranet has always been a completely separate thing, completely separate to this. Yeah, don't ask me why.
How did you engage with users on applying retention labels? How is this working out, and are they being applied correctly? Not just users applying perhaps the highest because they're not sure.
So I did a video that was kind of talking them through it, talking them through how to do it and technically how it works and all that kind of thing. I think it is working out quite well because, like I say, I can see in Purview in the background, I can see that people are adding that 2-year label and that 4-year label. So they aren't just using the highest because they're not sure. I would not be surprised in the slightest if that was happening in some areas, but I guess the positive there is at least they're applying labels, so it's something. It's better than nothing. But yeah, that again is an ongoing process, and it's something that will fall into the community of practice as well. We need to keep talking, keep engaging with people about this, because otherwise they'll do it a little bit and then they'll forget about it and go away.
We've got another question about the recent changes to storage allocation from Microsoft. I don't know if there's anything else that you'd like to say on that one.
We are doing what we can to avoid additional costs, but I don't think we will avoid it. Like absolutely way down long term, we probably won't avoid additional costs. But yeah, we're doing what we can.
Next one, is there anything you did in terms of setup that you either would not have done if you had your time over again? Are there any gotchas? You know, what are the pitfalls we can avoid?
I think I'm not sure we found them just yet. to be honest. I'll keep you posted. We've not found anything that's like, oh wow, we really shouldn't have done that. We've not found anything that's been really kind of show-stopping yet. So yeah, I'll keep you posted at a later date.
Conscious that we're at 2 o'clock, and I'm aware that colleagues will be having to drop off. What would you prefer to do? Would you prefer to answer the questions now, or shall we provide answers offline later?
I don't mind. I'm happy to provide the answers now. I've got the time if you want me to.
Great.
If you want me to carry on.
Let's do that then. So the next one, did you get users to migrate into pre-existing SharePoint sites or get them to create new ones with more IRM friendly file structures? If they were pre-existing, did you get users to clean these up to be more IRM friendly?
So we didn't enforce where they had to migrate content into. And a lot of people had that kind of hybrid setup. So some people were already using SharePoint. So if they wanted to migrate into there, we let them do that. It was entirely their choice. We didn't make people create sites that were more kind of information friendly. In the pre-existing sites, we didn't necessarily make people do any work on cleaning those up before content was moved in. I think we would hope, and we probably gave them the guidance, you've done it on the shared drive, so now do it on SharePoint. But we haven't enforced that. It would be lovely to do that. But we haven't. Yeah, so we very much left it to the users to define for themselves where it went and what content was in there.
Thanks. How did you deal with Excels with complex macros that were unsuitable for SharePoint environment? Was it similar to your approach to access databases?
Yes, is the really short answer to that one, because I can't give a very technical answer. But yes, we did have a couple of areas, especially finance, that were very tricky in terms of, well, we've got complex macros, but they also had like different links in different spreadsheets all over the place. So we had a kind of link fixer tool as well that was looking at that. But yes, on the whole, it was similar to the access.
Great. Just you're getting some lovely compliments in the chat as well.
There's Jude Koshwood. Thanks, Jude. And Sean was our absolutely amazing change management specialist, and Jude was our amazing project manager. So thank you very much, both. And I wish you were here to answer the questions.
Do you provide any content to students?
None of this was student content that we were looking at, or student related, student owned content. So all of this was staff content. Yeah. Yes, they do use SharePoint, they do use OneDrive, but we kind of leave them to it because they own their own content.
And I think that's the end of the questions. So thank you so much. Those were some fab questions, and thank you, Nicki, for your time in answering them. I can tell from the questions that people have found it a really useful session.
Good. There is just one more, sorry, that I just noticed. Mark Crawford, is that automated for creation of new sites or a manual process through a ticketing system? It is, and what they do is they go onto a ticketing system, they ask for the site to be created, they put in all the information, and it's then automated. It's not Power Apps, but I couldn't tell you what it is, sorry. But yes, it's all kind of done in the background. It just collects what we want.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Yeah, thank you, Nicki, for your time and sharing your experience. Everybody's found it really useful. We can tell from the questions and from the comments in the chat. So I will leave it there then, I think. I hope everybody has good afternoons, and goodbye.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Thanks.